Hi, thanks for coming out. Just so you're in the right room, we noticed the number on the room is not the same as the number that's on the sign, but you are betting against the odds. Security and stability when the odds are against you, or betting against the house. I said odds, but whatever. I even wrote that, so whatever. It's not important. Neither is this, but we'll tell you about us anyway. So my name is Neil Wyler. In the community, I am better known as Grifter. And I've been doing technical operations on site for Black Hat for the last 15 years. By day, I work for RSA doing threat hunting and incident response. I'm also a member of the Black Hat Review Board, where I help pick some of the content that comes to the stage, not this talk.
That's a conflict of interest.
Yeah, I think it is. And then the Training Review Board, which is also all the training classes we had earlier in the week as well. I'm also on the DEF CON Review Board, so I help pick the content there. And then I run the Contest Villages events, parties, and the demo labs at DEF CON. So I'm the department lead for that. And then I also am a board member for 801 Labs, which is the hacker space in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is where we hail from.
So my name is Bart Stump. My list is a little shorter than his, and it always is, but that's okay. I've been with the technical team for Black Hat about 10 years now. I'm an SE for Optiv by day. Also on the Black Hat Training Review Board, select the trainings. DEF CON Goon, I work for this guy in that capacity. And then again, also the 801 Labs board member.
All right. I guess before we even talk about the extended team here, we should talk about how we ended up being here. Essentially, the reason that we do the on-site technical operations is because years ago, 15 at that, I actually was complaining about how much Black Hat cost on the DEF CON forums, and somebody said, oh, hey, do you want to volunteer? Do you want to go help out? And so I was like, yeah, absolutely, that'd be great. And I went out and volunteered for the first time. I went out to a show they had in Seattle called the Windows Show, Black Hat Windows, that was a thing, right in Microsoft's backyard. And I went out for that show, and between that show, the person who was running the network operations left the company, and they called me up and said, hey, do you want to do it for the US show? We really liked working with you out in Seattle. And so I did. And the network was really stable, everything was great, and they were like, we want to take you everywhere, like, do you want to come to all of our shows? Which actually, my first Black Hat International show was here in Singapore in 2003, so something like that.
So the extended team, this has grown quite a bit, and we'll get into this here in a little bit, kind of the evolution of what Black Hat has become, and the network side of it at least. But our extended team includes Palo Alto Networks, RSA, Ruckus, Gigamon, and then My Republic is our ISP. So you can kind of understand what all these other guys would do. Outside of RSA, they have NetWitness and some identity and access management stuff that they're providing for us as well.
We'll get into
Ruckus,
that.
all wireless, Palo Alto firewalls. So that's the extended team. So at the end of the US show, we usually give a quick debrief, do a talk kind of like this. We didn't want this to be exactly the same, but we wanted to show some stuff and kind of compare and contrast between the US show and this show. So here's a quick glance of the amount of traffic and everything that was passed at the US show. Wait for it. Here's the amount that we've passed here. So the max packet capture rate that we had was about 864 megs, 2.4 terabytes of total packets, 17,000 million network sessions, and only 28 unique network protocols. But we do see quite a few packets on non-standard, which is typical.
Sorry, it says packets instead of sessions like the last one, but we built this deck 30 minutes ago.
Don't tell them that.
So. One thing, though, that's interesting is if you look at it, by and large, this show, attendance-wise, is about 10% the size of what the U.S. show is, and it reflects that in the traffic as well. So you guys are hitting the network as hard as the average attendee at the Las Vegas show is too, by number of logs captured, network sessions, and bandwidth. Bravo.
Bravo, for sure. So here comes the fun stuff. Here's what our network looked like at the U.S. show last year. A little more complex than you might imagine, I guess, setting it up in just a few days and running it for a week, and then tearing it all down. Now, let's go back and forth here again a little bit. Here is what it looks like at the U.S. show, or excuse me, this show. You can see RSA and everybody in line there that they get all of their data off of a tap from Gigamon. Palo Alto's providing us all the firewalling and stuff there. Ruckus, again, all of the wireless. And then we've got some servers that we run different tools on as well, open source.
So it seems like, I mean, it might seem a little bit like over-engineered if we look at, you know, what we do in the U.S. and then what we do here as well, even for a show of this size. But essentially what we're trying to do is stand up an enterprise class network in what turns out for us to be here, it's a day. And then at the US show, it is now turned into, what, 2 days, 2.5?
It's going to be more than that.
So it's scope creep, right? So it's getting longer and longer as the network gets larger and as we bring in additional things to shore up the network or work with different vendors, manufacturers, that kind of stuff. Or we just come up with different ideas that we're like, oh, it would be nice to monitor these things or see those things. So yes, it's a little over-engineered, we'll admit that. But we also, we like shiny things. And so we have access to them, and so we're going to use them.
So, as Grifter said, he's been around about 15 years doing this, and you can see the evolution of just what the show has become from the technical aspect. It was a few guys in a closet with all kinds of old school gear that he can ramble off into what we have today. The U.S. show, the NOC is a little different. You can come in and see the NOC and all of our fun tools. You can see that we've got tons of displays.
They cannot see that because that looks terrible.
You chose it.
Yeah. No, but I mean, just the light is directly over the screen.
So this was just to kind of illustrate, obviously, the difference. So we wanted to give you a little bit of insight into the network and what it looks like in contrast to the U.S. show. But this is the information we really want to get into.
I want to talk about this a little bit, though. So the reason we call this evolution is because when we started out, or when I started out doing it 15 years ago, this was the first U.S. show that I did. So like I said, this summer will be my 15th U.S. show. When we initially were doing it, we had roughly between 1,200 to 1,500 attendees. We were running it off of Cisco access points with Orinoco cards in them. And you can see these little antennas here that you would attach them to and like tape to the wall to try to get better coverage and that kind of thing. And a single Cisco 2600 router. So that, the next year, this was the entirety of the NOC/SOC. So I only put this here because the only thing that changed was we bought those sweet little silver Netgear switches there. Felt pretty good about that. But at a certain point, we had to scale. So attendance grows, the number of training classes grows. When we started out with this setup, we were looking at 1,200 to 1,500 attendees, and how many classes? It was like a dozen classes. Now the US show is 15,000 attendees and 60 classes, all of them with unique network requirements that we talk to them about. But prior, they say, I need this, I need it closed like this. Students should not be able to talk to each other, or they should. I want to be able to pass this type of traffic, those things. When it started to get to that point, we had to get out of that mom and pop mentality of we could just buy something at Fry's, bring it in, hook it up, and then run it out of what is essentially a closet, what that room was, and then adapt into something that was more of a traditional NOC or SOC type atmosphere, where we were actually putting up visualizations, monitoring the network throughout, and then adapting to any threats or changes. And so this talk is more about those type of things, like what have we learned while doing this? And one of them was that at a certain point, this doesn't work anymore. Doing it out of a closet with something that you go and buy at Best Buy or just get dropped from Amazon doesn't work. And you have to start, and you have to realize where that shift is. Like, where are we going to start taking this more seriously and putting more, I guess, oomph behind it. And we'll talk about a little bit more how we adapted into doing that.
So here's the fun stuff that we wanted to kind of help let you apply to yourself a little bit as well. So we'll talk about the staffing here now and kind of how that works. So for example, at the US show, we have 21 people on our network team, as well as everybody that all these vendors bring. So the extended team brings out engineers that are experts on their platforms. And then we bring out 21 additional people to Las Vegas to run that show. Plus the 2 idiots that are standing up here. At this show, there's 2 idiots and 2 other people on the network team, and then the vendors bring their people as well. So staffing obviously is a big deal for us, and there's plenty of things that we can talk about here.
So just from a headcount standpoint, again, initially years ago, it was myself and 2 guys. So we did the entire network. Again, we're talking about much less equipment, much less attendees and staff and training classes. But at a certain point, we had to scale that team as well, and that required finding the right skill sets that those people had, and both from just a network architecture standpoint as well as security chops. And finding the right people and putting them in place. And I know, again, we're a little bit spoiled because we're Black Hat, so we get to say, does anybody want to help do network stuff at Black Hat? And a bunch of people are like, I'll do it. I'll do it. So
volunteers.
Our staff at Black Hat is to do the NOC is probably larger than most people's staff in their organizations. So we are spoiled in that standpoint. But what we learned is that not everybody was a generalist. Not everybody had the network chops and the security chops. So we needed to figure out what the right mix of those was. And we had to define who the right people were, who were going to lead that. So we break up those teams into separate, or that overall group into separate teams. They're on shifts, and then who can lead that. We put under here conflict because inevitably when you have 21 people who are all experts in their particular field, you get a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and everybody has their opinion about how the right way it should be done, and there is conflict. And so we find the people who handle that conflict well and come out with a solution, and we put them in a leadership position, and then there's more conflict, and we figure that out and we work with it together. So that's normal. You guys are going to experience that in your own environments as well. But again, for us at least, we only have to deal with each other for about a week and a half, and then everybody goes back to their day jobs, except for us. We see each other all the time. I hate you.
I love you too.
And so attrition-wise, we also people come in, they're taking their time off of work to be able to come in and do this. So we have people leave all the time. Now the problem with attrition is that we have folks who we give them a certain responsibility or group of responsibilities, and that's the guy or gal who does that for the next 3 years. And if we don't make sure that there isn't just tribal knowledge that's kept in that person's head, and that they're not training the people around them or spreading that knowledge out, when that individual leaves, we experience pain. And we have gone through that before, where somebody's like, oh, I can't come this year, I've got to go do whatever. And we're like, who's going to run that now? And then you're calling them from Las Vegas and being like, I'm sorry, I don't want to reset all of these, devices that you configured. What are the passwords on it? Because they're not written anywhere. So we have to learn those lessons the hard way.
So the design of the network and kind of how that has evolved, obviously, is massive. But even from show to show, there's tons of changes and tons of planning and tons of obviously the show here in Asia is completely different than the show at the US, which we showed. But there's a lot that goes into the design of the network, including the amount of classes, the amount of attendees we expect, the floor plan that we're using, that all comes into play. So there's quite a bit that happens here. Plenty of pre-planning. There's an amazing liaison that helps us out for months ahead. Months
Walter.
ahead of time.
Walter, wave at them.
Walter,
wave at them. Walter. No, you turn around and you wave, Walter.
Walter's amazing and helps us obviously kind of wade the waters of involving everybody and getting this all done. But there's months of pre-planning even for this show. jumping on calls with all the different vendors, making sure that they're on the same page and that we're getting this all done the right way. But again, that's kind of excelled from what you would expect in an enterprise environment. Budget. Obviously, there's dollars that come into play, and there's some different things that we'll talk about here coming up that come into play. Obviously, the vendors, can they bring millions of dollars worth of equipment? We'd love to have it, but there's a budget that comes in there.
Black Hat's expensive, but that doesn't all go to the knock guys to spend however they want. It's interesting to have to figure out, okay, like here is what you guys are allocated for whatever we push for more, just like any other organization does. And so we're trying to stand something up that is an enterprise class network with what is primarily a group of volunteers, and then trying to figure out where we can spend money on equipment as far as like, are we going to purchase something, or are we going to work with another group to get something like that? And we'll touch on that in a little bit. But the like from a budget standpoint, we know it's not unlimited, and it's not for us either. So we have to go through and figure out, okay, what are we going to get for this show? Do we need to get new equipment? When can we get that equipment, and how long will we have to use it before we're ever going to see budget for that again? And then at times, and this has happened before, years ago, we had a way of doing things. We were very much a roll your own shop. We did SoCris boxes with OpenBSD on them and PF, and like we were like everything was open source, and we were doing it ourselves. And we bought a bunch of equipment and to do that with, and then not too long into that process, show wise, we were like, oh, man, this was a terrible mistake. Like we had essentially like purchased a bunch of stuff, and we were like, okay, I don't know if we've done the right thing here, and having to go back to management at Black Hat and say, okay, we think we actually need to go in a different direction. We're going to have to find some other things, is something that is really difficult to do. And we know that happens in enterprises as well. You have some sales guy and an SE come in, and they take you to lunch, and they're like, it does all the things and it makes toast. And you're like, awesome, we're going to get it. And it turns out to be the wrong thing for your environment. And now you have to go back to the CIO and say, like, so about those firewalls. It turns out it's just clip art that looks like a brick wall on fire. It doesn't do anything else. So you have to go back and say, like, I need more budget, or we're going to need to put it here and here and work with that. And we do that as well. You want to get into the functionality?
So the functionality of everything obviously comes into play. And as he said, you can have a sales rep and an SE come in and tell you we'll do everything that you need to do. But we've got to test that functionality. We've got to make sure that the vendor products integrate and different things work together. For example, we brought in RSA's Identity and Access Management this year. Well, Palo Alto couldn't do it until it was 8.0.1, the latest release that they've got, and we have to make sure that that's there. So the functionality and the integration of those products is obviously really important, and things that we have to test out long before we're on site. Otherwise, there can and have been issues in the past that we've ran into and said, oh crap, we can't do that now. So as you can see here, design takes quite a bit of time and effort, and it's completely different for every show.
Right. And as we continue to scale things and add different vendors, different stuff like that cross-pollination, that ability to communicate with one another becomes more and more critical. Like you said, it sounded like you were saying that Palo Alto can't do IAM or whatever, but what he's saying is the communication between the two vendors only took place at a certain version. We had to make sure we worked with each other to ensure that those versions were met and that the actual communication take place. We got on multiple calls to make sure that happened. Walter liaised the hell out of it. You liaised it, buddy.
And then we do all the cybering as well.
Yes, all the cyber.
We just had to throw cyber in there.
Sprinkle in some cyber.
I want to point out before you change, there's a dragon on a freaking Segway.
Like a boss.
It's amazing.
All right.
So the infrastructure.
So infrastructure-wise, I mentioned it briefly a minute ago. We were very much, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to get this stuff that's just from Best Buy or Fry's or whatever. That's how we ran things for a few years. And then we said, okay, we are bigger than that. We want to start putting a firewall in every single one of the training rooms. So we're talking about 50 different, firewalls, each one, so we can manage this or that or whatever. But at the same time, we're trying to be budget conscious. Plus, we're huge nerds. So we're like, open source, woo! And that's what we did. And like I said, open source is great if you have like the staff to manage that, so if you're a university, then use all the open source projects that you can, because you can just throw students at it or whatever. In our case, that's kind of the way we looked at it a little bit, was we're like, okay, we have plenty of people. We've got all this staff on site. We'll just throw bodies at it and we'll get this all deployed. But then as the show kept growing and growing, and the number of classes kept growing and the size of those classes was growing, we realized that didn't scale, because it took more management of those open source things than it would if we would have just bought something that was, proprietary, but a vendor type solution that just did everything out of the box, but cost a bunch of money. So
it's give and take, and we don't want to say that we don't use open source. We haven't moved to a complete vendor solution. There's definitely a place for that open source technology, and
Sure.
we still use plenty of open source tools for monitoring and plenty of other things on the network, visibility, etc. So getting into open source versus proprietary is completely different for everybody, but there is a line that is drawn in the sand somewhere that whether that functionality versus cost is going to
there's definitely
play
a
out.
cost-benefit ratio, and we hit the wall on that on a few things. But like I said, some stuff just works, and so we like that, or it's low maintenance, or we make Steve Fink do it. Let's see. So vendor selection. So one thing was like, when we're doing all this stuff, and we're like, okay, we scaled beyond the commercial off-the-shelf stuff. We scaled beyond open source projects and whatever. We're totally in this vendor place now. How are we going to get Black Hat to pay for all this stuff? And then it was literally like, what if we just ask the vendors if we can use their stuff, and say, like, we want to use it at Black Hat. Let's ask. And we were like, hey, if we wanted to use your equipment in the NOC at Black Hat, like, would you sponsor that equipment to us? And they were like, yes, like immediately. Like, it was like, yes, here's the gear. Here's all of the gear. Like,
And the
yes,
people.
And the
There's
people
more than
and
just
everything.
the gear,
Yeah.
the people behind that as well.
And so, so then it became, okay, well, what's the right thing? So there have been, we've had different vendors in for different things and the different aspects that we use in the NOC. We bring folks in, we're using their stuff for a while, and in the same way that you guys will see, like in your environments, one, either it does not do what you expected it was going to do, or it doesn't scale to a certain point. Something tips over, and you're like, okay, we're now beyond what this product can do. I'm not going to call out, particular logos and stuff, but we've only been using vendors for a few years. And we have had some changes take place in there, because sometimes it just doesn't meet the business need.
So scope creep. This is kind of interesting, and I put it in quotes because it's not necessarily the scope that we have of the work that we're doing, but the scope creep in the sense that we've got. You saw the amount of vendors that we have, and some of these vendors can do certain things that the other vendors can do, et cetera. And so we got to kind of make sure that everybody's happy in that sense, and that we're utilizing the tools in the best way that we can, and that's efficient for us and the network that we have. So you've got to be conscious of scope creep. What one vendor can do, another may be able to do as well, but it may not be the same. You talk about best of breed and all that kind of stuff. So that's something certainly to be conscious of as well.
Yeah. We also, we just don't need everybody fighting. Actually, everybody gets along pretty well. We're idiots in the NOC, and so they have fun. All right, so we'll also talk about maintenance, so maintaining this. Like, what does it take to maintain this type of network? Not only before the show ever happens, but on site. So things happen on site that we have to account for. Do we do that in-house, or do we allow one of the vendors and their team of experts that they bring along to manage that part for us? Again, we have fallen down flat on our face on this one before. So we have worked with a vendor in the past. We brought them in specifically to provide some functionality. we're used to running everything ourselves. We'd been doing it that way for over a decade, but they were very nervous about their name being involved with Black Hat. They didn't want to get hacked or have anything happen when their logo was up on the wall. And so at one point, they legitimately locked us out of our own equipment because they were like, oh, well, we've put the configs where we want them, and we just can't have you guys making changes. And we're like, that's not how any of this works. So do you decide to do things in-house? What are you giving up from a control standpoint? Or do you use something like a managed service in your normal organization? On the patch management side, we had a vendor who they were like, okay, we know that there's some issues with this version. We need to upgrade to the next version because we're at Black Hat and things are scary. And after everything had already been done, pushed updates to devices that were deployed throughout the network without any discussion with the two of us. It actually, and then didn't test it. It ended up taking the network down for about 2 hours on the morning of one of the days, which is the longest outage that we had ever had, and that I've ever had in the 15 years in his decade with Black Hat. So it was our longest outage, and it was because they thought they were doing something good. They pushed something out, didn't realize that it was going to affect something else, and ended up and causing an outage. Where on the other side, we had a talk given at Black Hat where the person got up on stage and said, oh, by the way, this vendor has a hole in this, and just dropped it on stage, and it happened to be part of the infrastructure that we were using for the show, and we were like, oh no. And so we went to the vendor and we said, what are you guys doing? And they're like, we're on it. And they actually made us a patch within hours, and then we had it deployed that day. As soon as everybody had stopped the training for the day, we had that patch in place and deployed. So sometimes you have to decide, when is this going to take place? Is it worth the risk? In this case, we got together and decided that it was worth the risk because of the vulnerability that was in that equipment.
So AAA, obviously, it's important in any organization and environment, but until recently, we hadn't gone that far. And that, again, comes to your open source and in-house versus managed, et cetera, cost to benefit ratio there. We've recently put that in place, and it's phenomenal. It's going to give us a lot of visibility. Obviously, if AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting. Accounting is a big deal to us with the experience that Grifter just explained. We had no way to stop them from pushing that change because they had the local admin account just like everybody else did that pushed it. And we now are kind of that line of defense to say, are we going to do that? So it's a big deal in the maintenance side of it, and really gives us a good baseline to kind of build off of for bigger shows, obviously, like the US, and have that accounting and authorization in place.
In the same way that you guys manage your networks, or you take care of your SOC or whatever, and that is your baby, and you have people who come in there and they're analysts and they do whatever. So if you're managing a SOC and there's incidents coming in the queue and somebody takes something and they go, oh yeah, that's nothing, and they throw it away, or they close the ticket, and it turns out that actually is something, and you have a problem, it's not like the analyst, isn't the only one who gets hosed, like you do as well. So in that case, we weren't the ones who pushed this configuration change, but our name is associated with the network, and the Black Hat name is associated with the network, and so that's what looks bad. Is it makes Black Hat look bad, it makes us look bad, so that's why that the AAA portion of it, getting that stood up. So again, lesson learned. Like, we got burned by something, and now nobody can push a config change or do anything like that without one of us approving it. So.
And then baseline configs to kind of wrap up here. We've got, we go with baseline configs. We want something to kind of build off of so we don't have to do it from scratch every time. But again, we've explained that the environment's changed there, and there's quite a bit there. But having a baseline config or a golden image to that extent is very important. Have that backed up, prepared to use in case of any oh shit moment. So
Yeah.
pardon my French.
Is that French?
Anything? I don't know.
So yeah, I think for the most part we've covered everything. Normally we do this and we have an hour and we talk about a lot more. We dig into a lot more of the stats and we give you guys time for questions. But we gotta cut it here. But if you guys do have questions, you can come up to us. We'll just be hanging out afterwards. So thanks.
Thank you.